Thank you for tuning in to QA Bytes. In the last episode, we discussed common obstacles to implementing performance-related activities in DevOps development cycles. In episode 2 of the Effective Performance Testing in DevOps series, we're discussing the importance of incorporating performance requirements in user stories and building accountability around performance. As we discussed in the previous episode, one of the huge holes in most organizations is the failure to think about performance from the beginning. Many times this hole was created in older software development processes where understanding the performance of the system was someone else's responsibility. For example, in situations where the system is turned over to the Performance Testing Center of Excellence at the end of a long waterfall cycle. But just as big of a concern is making organizations lazy when it comes to performance, as it was always someone else's problem. A great way to address that is to consider performance requirements and factors when stories are being created. So as you're creating your stories, think about the performance factors that are important to that specific story. For example, let's think about performance factors related to a story that describes the ability of a dealer of farm equipment to create quotes in the field. Maybe we know that we have a peak of around 1,200 concurrent users creating quotes, and given that we'll be literally out in the field, we need to consider varying network conditions. And we don't want the users to deal with anything worse than 2-second response time from screen to screen. I don't recommend spending too much time on this. At this point, we're just getting the performance factors out in the open for the entire team to see, and not leaving it for a performance engineer to worry about right before release. Thinking about performance factors is a good first step, but how can we incorporate performance requirements more formally in our work? I've seen a handful of approaches, and what's right depends a bit on the organization and how they prefer to work. But one of the more popular approaches is to include performance requirements as constraints that a subset, or even all, of your stories need to meet. If you think about performance requirements, things like response time, support for a number of concurrent users, or throughput, they often apply to many user stories, not just one. So as we create stories, we can link their acceptance criteria as appropriate to existing constraints. For performance requirements that are specific to a story, it may make sense to include them directly in the acceptance criteria. However, we need to be mindful that user-level performance criteria likely can only be tested at the system level in a production-like environment. So in the above example, I'm not going to get meaningful results for high concurrency, high throughput tests in an environment that isn't sized appropriately. The important thing to remember is how you approach incorporating performance requirements should fit with the way your organization prefers to work. The key is to begin to develop team awareness of performance factors. The method by which you do that is a bit less important. Start with what seems to make sense for your organization and expand what works and pivot away from what doesn't. Another common thing that's missing for us to be able to incorporate performance testing and analysis in our pipelines is accountability. It's not surprising that we see a lack of accountability for performance testing. There's still a lot of inertia around traditional performance testing where it was someone else's responsibility. We just talked about awareness, and I believe awareness is an important prerequisite to accountability. If our teams aren't aware of what we're trying to accomplish and why, it's hard to hold them accountable. Two important ways to build awareness are to discuss performance factors that are relevant to our stories early on, and then incorporate performance-related requirements in them. We also need visibility. Awareness is one thing, but if we're not constantly reminded of how important performance is, we're going to likely let it slip into the background. I found the best way to keep performance visible is to ensure our definition of done requires us to document performance factors and performance-related acceptance criteria as part of our stories. Building accountability is a great gateway to performance moving from a localized responsibility to becoming everyone's shared responsibility. It doesn't mean that everyone is a performance tester or a performance engineer, but it does mean that everyone is aware of performance and have the appropriate responsibility relative to their role. Thank you for watching this episode of QA Bytes. Tune into the next episode where we'll begin to discuss how to implement performance activities at each stage in the delivery cycle.